Well, thank you and for the opportunity to talk today. Julian Adamson, one of the people from Rare Cancers who's been organising this event for us today, emailed me to say where was my PowerPoint for the presentation. And I emailed back saying, look, I know I'm talking in the afternoon after all those scientists, after the clinicians. They always have these glossy presentations with these great pictures. I'm not going to try and compete with that. So, let me just start by thanking Richard and Kate Vines and the team at Rare Cancers for organising this meeting and other meetings that I've had an opportunity to talk at to discuss the issues of access to medicines for cancer. As the Minister said, we have one of the best healthcare systems in the world on many measures, on many measures of access and outcome. This includes a system for regulation and funding of prescription medicines that has resulted in access to a very broad range of effective medicines at a very low cost to most patients, effectively the co-patient. It has resulted in controlled growth in total cost of medicines to the community that is the envy of many countries. But when we stop asking ourselves how we can make our health system even better, then that's the moment we'll start to go backwards as a health system. And that's the spirit in which I present this paper today. However, it's also important that if we are proposing change, that we don't lose what we already have or replace one set of issues with a different set. So I welcome the opportunity to be here today for this discussion. My talk is roughly divided into three sections with reference to cancer medicines. First, I believe it's important that a discussion on what can be improved has to start from knowing what exists now. So I'll briefly discuss some key issues, some key aspects and key issues around the Pharmaceutical Benefits Scheme and the Pharmaceutical Benefits Advisory Committee processes. Second, I want to talk about some general issues in evaluating cancer medicine that impact on PBAC decision making. And third, I'll talk specifically about access to medicines for rare cancers, where I see some issues and some ideas that we might want to discuss at the end. I should start with a disclaimer. The analysis and views presented here are my own, although clearly seen through the perspective of my role as the chair of the PBAC. But the views I express should not be considered the views of the government or the Commonwealth Department of Health or even the full PBAC committee. It's important to understand that the PBAC does not set policy on access to medicines. It's a statutory advisory committee established under the National Health Act with a specified role to recommend to the Minister of Health what drugs should be subsidised on the PBS. It operates within the requirements of the Act and within the policy parameters defined by the government of the day. Combined with other requirements of the Act, it means that the PBAC has to decide and specify to the Minister in making its recommendations that a drug that it's recommending is cost effective or under what limited circumstances it might be cost effective. Specifically, it cannot make a positive recommendation for a medicine that is substantially more costly than an alternative medicine unless it is satisfied that the proposed medicine also provides a significant improvement in health. The challenge for the PBAC is that the Act doesn't specify further what substantially more costly and significant improvement in health means, and I'm sure that again is a matter for discussion. It's also important to note that the PBAC doesn't make decisions about individual patients' access to medicines. Sometimes it feels like that when we're considering access to medicines for groups as small as 5 to 10 new patients a year. It's impossible not to be touched by some of the correspondence and communication received by the PBAC, the Minister and the Department from individuals and families who see a glimpse of hope for a life-threatening or disabling condition in a medicine new or old that they don't have access to. As we've heard this morning, this is an exciting and interesting time in the development of new therapeutic approaches in cancer and many other diseases for that matter. There are new classes of drugs and therapies that hold promise as more beneficial than current therapies, and in some cases drugs where there were no previous options. As with past periods of discovery, and I lived through Herceptin, Glyvec, as just a couple of examples in this field, as with these past periods of discovery, this innovation brings with it a set of old and new challenges. So let me just touch on a few that have implications for PBAC decision-making and for access to medicines for rare cancer. It certainly appears to me that new medicines are coming to the market to the attention of clinicians and patients faster. it feels like the PBAC is increasingly seeing submissions for drugs with very limited clinical trial data. There are many factors driving this, including market forces and patient expectations. It's not surprising in this e-connected world that people with cancer hear of new medicines as soon as there's any public visibility, and the pharmaceutical and research communities are not above blowing early trumpets. A core component of what the PBAC does is consider the underlying comparative effectiveness, safety and cost of new drugs. One of the challenges with this faster-to-market environment is that the level of uncertainty about the relative benefits of a new medicine is increasing. In some cases, we have no direct evidence of the comparative effects and harms. It is frequently not clear where the medicine is best placed in therapy, for example, first line or third line, and where comparative data does exist, it may not be relevant to Australian practice. We've heard a lot about targeting of therapy to patient groups based on factors like disease type or stage or even molecular markers is not totally new in PBAC decisions. However, the increased discovery and use of molecular markers is adding another level of complexity. When the response to the drug is absolute, that is, when the drug only works when a specific target receptor or biomarker is present, it's relatively easy. However, in many cases, the effect is not absolute, and we've heard that brilliantly described in a couple of the presentation before last. It may depend on the level of degree of expression of the biomarker, and the detection of this may be test dependent. When the test is conducted on a sample of tissue, it may be influenced by the quality of the sample, or even when in a progressing disease, the sample is taken. The rate of discovery of new biomarkers is such that it's not unusual for a new biomarker to be discovered and trialled during the course of an already commenced drug trial. Interpretation of additional benefit of targeting can be particularly difficult in such circumstances. In terms of today's topic, this is important because it can lead to another apparent inequity in access. One aspect of new cancer therapies which is clear is that the cost of incremental improvements is growing, especially in the cancer field. A recent study in the USA of 58 anti-cancer drugs approved between 1985 and 2003 found that the average launch price of anti-cancer drugs, adjusted for inflation and health benefits, increased by 10% annually, or an average of $8,500 a year. Of course, this needs to be weighed up against the improvements in benefits, and the same study estimated while there were some increases in survival, it was patchy and it was not necessarily consistent. This leads me to another area, the size of improvement that is considered important. Many people with cancer not responding to therapy may place a high value on any potential benefit, and in doing so will be prepared to trade off significant consequences from drug side effects. Clinicians, while cognizant of the patient's interests, will also have a view, both singly and collectively, about what's an important improvement. This is referred to as the minimally important clinical difference and is influenced by many factors, including the likely survival for that type of cancer and the stage of the disease. The PBAC has the difficult task of weighing up that minimally important difference against the incremental cost that goes with it. In Australia, it would be a great benefit to the PBAC to have more information from patient groups about what patient groups consider to be minimally important clinical differences, and importantly, why they think that difference is important. There are many other factors that are increasing the level of uncertainty that the PBAC is dealing with in its decisions, including the uncertainty of relationship between intermediate markers of progression-free survival and overall survival, the length of follow-up in studies, rarely more than a couple of years, compared with the extrapolated benefits in cost-effectiveness models, commonly 10 years or more, and the interpretation of effectiveness when significant numbers of patients switch from the control arm in studies on the progression of disease. Predicting the size of the treatment population, which then forms the basis of estimating the total cost, is difficult when clinician experience and patient pressure leads to use beyond the patient population as included in the original trials. Let me now move on to consider some specific issues around cancers. I won't dwell on it here, but there is an issue about what we mean by rare cancers. Sophie, a little unfairly I think, asked this question of the Minister. It could mean the overall numbers of people with a newly diagnosed specific cancer, or subgroups of a larger, more common cancer defined by either some biologic or clinical characteristic, or even patients with common cancers that have failed to respond to available therapies. At one level, the issue is unimportant if the question is one of some sense of inequity in access to care. At another, particularly when considering the overall impact, for example, on program costs, it may be the key issue. We have, as the Minister said, mechanisms for dealing with rare diseases such as the Life-Saving Drugs Program, but these diseases fall into the ultra-rare category. There's only about just over 200 patients in that total program at present. I'd like to spend the rest of my paper exploring the reasons why there may be issues of access to medicines for rare cancers, obviously through a PBAC lens. There are several reasons why patients or clinicians want to access drugs outside of the approved or subsidised indications. I'll assume here that the context is that there is either failure of available treatment options or no treatment options. Then the reasons for seeking access probably boil down to one or more of the following. The drug is registered for the rare cancer with or without subsidy in some other jurisdiction, or there is published, albeit usually limited, evidence, case reports or case series suggesting that the drug may have a positive effect on a particular type of rare cancer of interest, or the drug is approved for use with or without subsidy in other cancers that may share a molecular target in common with the rare cancer, or the patient has trialled the drug with response, for example, through a company compassionate access program or personal funding, but is unable to continue that mode of access, commonly because of the company starts to charge for the drug, or the patient has exhausted other therapeutic options and is wanting to try anything that might be effective. So what then are the barriers to access? There are three main reasons why patients may not be able to access the drug. First, the drug may not be registered in Australia at all. This may mean that the company has never sought to have the drug listed in Australia, or less commonly, that it was not accepted for registration by the TGA. More commonly, the TGA-approved indications for the drug do not include all cancers for which the drug may be used, and that's particularly a problem with rare cancers, obviously. Second, the drug is TGA approved for indication, but is personally prohibitively expensive and has not been recommended for PBS listing. Non-availability on the PBS may be because there has not been a submission for subsidy for a particular indication, or the sponsor sought listing for only specific cancer types or for a specific stage of the disease, or the submission may have been rejected by the PBAC for reasons of poor cost effectiveness for a particular type of cancer. A third reason to bear in mind that from the perspective of equitable access is that there may have been healthcare access issues that mean the patient is not referred to a centre which do have access to the drugs. Some public hospitals provide more liberal access to some cancer drugs, or they may be more involved in clinical trials where there's access to the drugs, and private insurance may fund some treatments on a discretionary basis. For the purposes of today, the two most relevant issues from my perspective are where the drug is not registered and not subsidised for a specific rare cancer indication, but is registered or subsidised for a different but not rare cancer, or where the drug is registered for a specific rare cancer but not subsidised. Let's consider the situation where the cancer drug is not registered and not subsidised. The most common reason for this is that at one point in time, there was a lack of evidence of efficacy and safety in the specific patient population as required for TGA assessment. Without TGA registration, there is limited capacity for the PBAC to consider subsidy. The recent review of TGA registration processes and the government's response to that may help with faster registration. It could assist access for patients with rare cancers where there is registration in another country with comparable registration requirements. It's less clear to me at present that it helps with broadening of registration, such as might be the case, which might be the more relevant case for rare cancers. There will still be need for a sponsor, and there will still be need for some evidence of efficacy and safety. However, even without TGA registrations, patient may gain access to the drug through special access schemes, and providing the patient meets the requirements of either those two special access scheme pathways, which includes the drug supply arrangements, then the principal barrier is the cost of the drug borne by the individual patient. Now let's consider the situation where a cancer drug is registered but not subsidised. The process for consideration for PBS subsidy is an applicant-driven process, and applicants make decisions about whether to seek subsidy for a narrow or broad indications for a range of reasons other than the scope of the TGA registration. Probably the commonest reason for not applying is the extent of information that the applicant needs to provide to meet the requirements of the PBAC guidelines, and the likelihood that at the price the applicant is seeking, that it will meet the cost-effectiveness requirements of the PBS legislation. Where an application has been made, reasons for rejection include lack of acceptable evidence of greater efficacy or safety to warrant a higher price than the comparator therapy, or the high requested price relative to the additional benefits leading to unacceptable cost-effectiveness. What then are the options for access under current policy parameters? Mechanisms already exist within the TGA to consider rare conditions through the rare drug criteria. The PBAC also has precedents for consideration of drugs where there is limited randomised control evidence of effectiveness. The lack of specific cost-effectiveness threshold, the lack of a specific cost-effectiveness threshold also provides the PBAC with some leeway to consider high-cost drugs, and the PBAC regularly deals with situations where the cost-effectiveness differs by indications within the same, for the same drug. Another avenue is the rule of rescue. This is a set of 5 criteria that the PBAC can apply when no alternative exists in Australia to treat the patients with specific conditions that are in effect otherwise terminal. However, as both systems are application-driven, there has to be a party, usually a company, with access to the relevant information and willing to put together an applications. Parties other than the company can make applications, and I commend Rare Cancers for putting forward 2 applications in the current round. However, in general, it will be challenging for third parties to get access to the available unpublished evidence. It still requires a party to agree to supply arrangements and pricing data, which will be impossible without the involvement of the relevant company. I think this is an area where there's room for some new approaches, and I think for potentially for a more collaborative approach to submissions to the PBAC, which is why I commend the Rare Cancer for bringing forward those 2 applications so we can think through some of these issues. While I do not think the current mechanisms to provide access to medicines for people with rare cancers are being fully utilised, as I noted at the beginning of my paper, it's important that we are willing to look for areas where we can improve current arrangements. I also note that it is important that when we propose changes, that we do not inappropriately distort existing mechanisms that apply to achieve appropriate, safe and effective use of medicines for the larger patient community and the value for money for the greater community. Acceptable options should not, for example, create disincentives for companies to seek broader subsidy for a drug or to undertake research to demonstrate the effectiveness and value of the drug. Parameters that would need to be resolved in weighing up options include whether the eligible drug would need full TGA approval, the basis of the subsidy level, eligible patient criteria, and risk-share arrangements with the relevant company. Now, I stress that what follows is not government policy direction, nor as far as I'm aware being considered by the Department or Government. But I want to raise it. I want to raise it for discussion so we can see some of the issues that arise, and I'm not necessarily endorsing any of the options. For the purposes of the discussion, I limit the scenario to the situation where there is current TGA approval but not PBS subsidy, or where the existing registered indications do not include the rare cancer, but there is specific clinical and biological rationale for the use with the rare cancer of interest. For example, the rare cancer expresses the same molecular target as the registered indication, excuse me, and there is published evidence of response to the drug for the specific cancer in humans, but where the trial data is limited by reason of patient numbers. In my view, where the drug does not meet those criteria and has never been used for a specific rare cancer, then the most appropriate process for access and public funding is through a clinical trial. So, what other options could be considered? The most common reason for a TGA registered drug not being recommended for the PBS is that the high cost relative to the incremental increase in effectiveness results in poor cost effectiveness. As noted above, the PBAC does not use a fixed cost effectiveness threshold, indeed has previously recommended a few medicines under exceptional circumstances with high to very high incremental cost effectiveness ratios. It is in the realms of possibilities that government could be more directive to the PBAC about the circumstances where it was prepared to accept higher incremental cost effectiveness. The life-saving drug programs is an example of a program where in effect government has accepted a high level of uncertainty and a higher cost per patient, albeit for very small patient numbers. Another option which has been suggested is some form of provisional extended PBS listing to go with the provisional registration that we heard about earlier. Where a drug is TGA registered for a rare cancer and listed on the PBS for indications other than the rare cancer, then the PBAC could be given flexibility to recommend a provisional extended listing within the PBS. The listing would in fact be similar to a managed entry arrangement with agreed risk share arrangements with the company, the requirements that patients participate in data collection and review mechanisms. It's important that the parameters encourage full applications. Given that the cost effectiveness of the drug for a specific rare cancer indication would be unknown, in most cases the price would reflect this and would be substantially lower than the agreed price for the existing listing. This may involve some special pricing arrangements which take into account some sort of pay-for-performance mechanism. Provisional extended listings should be absolutely time-limited to ensure that companies respond to the conditions. Sorry, Sophie, were you waving at me to wrap up? Okay, please do. I might just dig a bigger, deeper hole for myself otherwise. In advance of any such listing, there would need to be an engagement with patients and clinicians so that individuals receiving the subsidised treatment explicitly consent to the data on effectiveness and harms being collected prospectively. The list of any such drugs would need to be more transparent so that we can communicate clearly and in a balanced way that the two possible options are either the drug proves to be sufficiently cost-effective to be listed on the PBS, or at the end of the period, the drugs would be delisted. So what about options where the drug is not registered and not subsidised? Options for public subsidy in the absence of TGA registration are much more constrained. The PBAC does not recommend listing drugs on the PBS that are not TGA approved. However, as I've already said, any person with terminal illness who has exhausted usual treatment options may seek access to a non-registered drug or a drug for a non-registered indication through the TGA Special Access Scheme with support of their clinician. For patients with non-terminal diseases, there is a more restricted access system which is also available that involves an independent paper-based assessment by a delegate. These schemes are available to and already used by patients with cancer and other disease. As I've already noted, a rate-limiting factor is that the patient or some other party must bear the cost of the drug. This is particularly a barrier when the drug is required on an ongoing basis, as is increasingly the case with some newer cancer drugs. So, it's been suggested that a case could be made for an exceptional circumstances funding program to subsidise access to drugs under such limited circumstances. Such a fund could operate in conjunction with the SAS approval process, and under this approach, the individual seeks access through the SAS pathway, and if there is a rational basis with that rare cancer and there is published evidence of response in humans for that drug in that specific cancer, then a subsidy is available. This would be conditional on response to the treatment in the case of drugs required on an ongoing basis. Such an approach would need to consider whether the subsidy was only available on demonstration of the response to the drug in the first place, whether there was a total cap on reimbursement, and the number of times that it could be used in any period of time. Parallels could be drawn with the medical treatment overseas program, which already exists under the Australian government program. It has very tight criteria and only applies in a relatively limited number of circumstances. From a government's funding perspective, there are a number of challenges to such an approach. These include the financial risks would be difficult to estimate but likely to be substantial. There's a potential to distort existing funding mechanisms. It could act as a disincentive to companies to conduct trials and for patients to participate in those trials. The issues of liability would need to be resolved to ensure the government as the funder was not accepting greater liability for an unregistered drug which is currently carried by the supplying company. That there's a risk of variable decision making as the process is based on individual applications, and it could be seen to be preferentially favouring one patient population, and indeed it would be hard to argue that such a scheme should not be extended beyond cancer. It could be administratively burdensome. If such a scheme existed, it would be preferable that there was a systematic collection of evidence about patient characteristics and outcomes that could contribute to knowledge about effectiveness. That brings me to my final options, which is subsidy for drug costs within clinical trials and cancers. As indicated above, it is possible to conduct clinical trials for people with rare cancers, but there's little interest for companies to do so when their business needs can be met through listings for other common cancers. There is a case for public funding of trials in such situations, and these may be conducted in ways that produce more relevant evidence for clinicians and funders than those conducted by industry. If this evidence subsequently led to broader registration for the drug by the TGA and the sponsor derives revenue from subsequent taxpayer subsidy, the government could recoup all or part of its investment against future PBS outlays for this drug for that indication. The government has already announced greater support for clinical trials, and in future the Medical Research Future Fund, as the Minister indicated, will provide an avenue for generating local evidence in rare cancers of interest to Australians, because its purpose is to provide a sustainable source of funding for such vital medical research. Finally, I'd like to comment on the proposal for a separate cancer fund similar to the English National Health Service cancer drug funds, which has been suggested in the recent Senate inquiry into access to cancer drugs report, and for which there has been some lobbying by patient groups and clinicians. I am very unenthusiastic about such an approach. The NHS fund is about broader access to high-cost cancer drugs which have had regulatory approval rather than rare cancer specifically. Different views exist on that model, which rapidly ran over budget and was seen to divert resources from other needs within the National Health Service. Moreover, it was criticised for poor value for money based on estimates of the cost effectiveness of the drugs that were included. It again has that potential to act as a disincentive for companies to develop further evidence, particularly in relation to rare subgroups of patients, and it obviously prioritises one group of patient needs over those of another. The justification, in my mind, for such a separate fund in the Australian context is much less clear, when the same objective but better outcomes could be achieved through modifications to the existing PBS or other pathways. Moreover, as I've mentioned above, it does not necessarily address the specific problems of access to drugs for people with rare cancers. So, in closing, I've just raised a few issues as I see them in relation to access to drugs for rare cancers. I acknowledge that it presents specific issues for regulatory and funding bodies, but I'm yet to be convinced that addressing many of these issues could not be achieved through existing mechanisms or with some relatively minor changes to the existing system. That said, it is important that we explore issues of equity of access to cancer drugs for people with rare cancers and considers what options might be feasible to address this if it is present. I've raised some possibilities for discussion, and I remind you in closing that the PBAC does not set policy and views, and the views raised here are mine and not a reflection of government policy directions or interests. So thank you for listening, and I look forward to discussion.